This is Carol Smaldino, and welcome to The Human Climate. My guest today is Jennifer Thompson. She is the founder of Healing Justice. So welcome. I'm glad you could make it.
Thanks, Carol.
So I was looking at the website for Healing Justice, and on it is written, from harm to healing. And then underneath, it says, we incorporate the interrelated and imperative concepts of healing and justice to address the widespread harm caused by systemic failures that result in wrongful convictions. You know, when I started this podcast, one of the things that dominated, let's say, my motivation was to humanize experience. You know, the idea of my own book, The Human Climate, is that emotions very often drive us. And if we don't know our emotions, we tend to project them onto other people. And we can demonize people and we can hate them. And then sometimes we idealize them and we put them on pedestals, which is not really any better because we don't, we stop being kind of the center of our own judgment, let's say. I know a little bit about your story, and I know that there was an experience of being kind of caught in that narrative. And so when we spoke, I told you that I don't want to do that. I don't want to be part of that. This is humanizing. We're all capable of everything. It's a Carl Jung expression, but it's true. We just are. So you agreed in the conversation to tell me about the narrative, and we agreed that we wouldn't stay stuck there. So could I ask you to do that?
Sure. Well, I guess let me first say that the narrative I got stuck in was that of being a crime survivor that had been asked to participate in a police procedure that ended up being flawed, unbeknownst to me, of course. And the failure of that procedure resulted in an innocent man going to prison and a guilty man being let, to be free for another 9 months. And so lots of people got harmed in this particular, story of mine. But the narrative that I got stuck in was not just being the crime victim, also eventually and ultimately in the public's opinion, being the perpetrator of the injustice. And I didn't really understand how that was happening. I didn't understand how that was working. I didn't even understand that I was in that narrative, in that box that I got placed in. So in 1984, I was a college student. I was working, dating a young man that we were, thinking about getting married. And then on July 29th at 3 a.m., a person broke into my home while I was sleeping, raped me at knife point. And through the act, the duration of the assault, I tried really hard to stay focused, stay present so that I could try to remember as much as I could about this person and what he looked like and what his voice sounded like, and what his clothes looked like, so that I could hopefully survive and then help the police find this person. And I was able to escape after about 20 minutes. I ran to a home. I didn't know who lived there, and the people that lived there were kind enough to save me. And I was taken to the hospital where a rape kit was being done. And it would be at the hospital that I had learned he had left my apartment after chasing me and then gone on to assault another woman who was about 25 years older than myself at the time. And so we knew we had a serial rapist. We knew that he was a danger. He was going to hurt other women. So it was really important that we found him. So I was taken then to the police station to give a description of the assailant, which resulted in a composite sketch that ran in the newspapers. And 3 days after my assault, there was a suspect, a young African-American man, same age as me, 22. And so he was brought in for questioning. His alibi didn't work. There had been a call that had come in from a woman who said she had seen him outside of my apartment at the exact same time as my assault, wearing the identical clothes that both the crime survivor and myself had described. And so it was clear to the police that they had gotten the right suspect, and his photograph was placed in a photographic lineup, and I picked him out. And then a week after the photographic lineup, they called me back to the police station to do a physical lineup. And in that physical lineup, same thing, I picked him out of the lineup. And so when both of those identifications occurred, the police said to me, "Good job, that's who we thought it was. You picked out the same person in the photograph." So for me as the victim and the survivor, I felt like I had gotten it right. The police wouldn't have put in to the lineup, an innocent person. So I felt really confident that I had done it. I'd done a good job. The second survivor had been beaten during her assault. She had not been able to make an identification. So they tried only my case, and that trial happened in January of 1985. It lasted 2 weeks. And at the end of the trial, the jury came back very quickly with the understanding that Ronald was guilty of all charges and would be sentenced to life and 54 years. And, sexual violence is, any kind of violence is an upending, a shredding of who you had been and who your family had been prior to this moment. And then this moment changed everything, and it disrupts, it creates really these catastrophic moments. And that's what happened to me. My life was no more what I had planned it to be. It was just, really shredded pieces of it. And my recovery was a disaster, because the system says to you, trial's over, now you have closure, which I hate that word, and we need to remove it from the criminal justice system. You have closure, you get to move on, you get to move forward, and all those types of things, which didn't remotely resemble what was actually happening in my life. And I tried, but it was a huge failure. I met a new man later, and we began to date. I got a job. And in 1987, the appellate court in North Carolina overturned the decision, saying that the jury should have known about the second survivor not being able to make an ID, and that perhaps my memory had been wrong. And then on the defense side, they had caught wind of this alternate suspect, this person who now was in prison with Ronald Cotton, and was, running around prison claiming that he had committed these crimes. And his name was Bobby Poole. So in the second trial, they tried both of our rape cases at the same time. And under voir dire, they removed the jury. They brought in this mystery person, Bobby Poole, who of course denied having any involvement in either one of the sexual assaults. And then both the second survivor and myself had no memory of him at all. And so Ronald was once again found guilty of now 2 rape charges and would spend 2 life sentences in prison. And again, you're patted on the back and you're told, that you get to put your life back together again. But every time the system does this, every time there's another disruption, every time there's an appeal or a parole or probation or whatever it is, it creates another chaotic moment, and you're shredded all over again. So I again attempted to move forward. I got married, I got pregnant. I had triplets in the spring of 1990.
I think I remember that.
2 little girls and a boy, which really became my my reason to keep living, to be perfectly honest with you. And I loved being a mother. It was my favorite thing I've ever done. Until 5 years later, Mike Galden, who had been the original investigator, came to my house with the ADA of Alamance County and talked to me about this
What's
thing.
the ADA?
is assistant district attorney.
Okay.
And it talked about this idea of post-conviction DNA testing. And I didn't really understand any of that. I didn't understand what post-conviction meant. I didn't understand any of it. But that Ronald was still claiming innocence. And if the courts allowed this testing to go through, my blood sample from 11 years ago had disintegrated. So I just looked at them and said, you know what, we're going to go to the lab today. You're going to take the blood. You're going to run that test, because at some point, really, there has to be a finality to this. And so we did. And I didn't think about it. And 3 months later, they came back to my house and looked at me and said that not only had it excluded Ronald Cotton as being the perpetrator, but it had indeed been a complete, indication that Bobby Poole had been the perpetrator of both of those crimes and had, committed other crimes during the time he was allowed to be free. And again, I mean, my life fell apart, but it fell apart in a really, really different way. I mean, in a really different way, because I didn't understand what had happened. I didn't understand trauma. I didn't understand memory. I didn't understand any of it. I just really went into a very, very deep, dark hole and tried very hard to make myself as tiny as possible in the world so that no one could ever find me. And I did a pretty good job for about a year until someone found me, who was out of Boston and was doing a documentary about the fallibility of eyewitness identification. And would I participate? And of course I said, no. Why would I ever want to do that? And of course he said, well, Ronald's going to tell his story. And that's when I realized, like, no one can tell your story but you. And I didn't want anybody else to tell my story because they didn't know my story. So I agreed to tell it with, both of us in totally different places. Ronald had to stay where he was and I had to stay where I was. So I was convinced that he was going to try to hurt me or my children. And after the documentary aired in February of 97, it was a very clear indicator that I had not healed at all and that I was really stuck.
I'm sorry, in what way?
I was trapped in hatred and anger and fear and bitterness and pain. I had not moved forward at all.
Hatred of?
I still saw him in my nightmares, even though I knew he was innocent. Had all these fears that I was very concerned were being blown onto my children. That as the saying goes, if we don't heal our wounds, we'll bleed on other people. And I knew I was doing that. So I asked for a meeting with Ronald Cotton in the spring of 1997. And I had no idea what I was doing, by the way. I had no idea, but I knew that I had to say something, and that I knew that he needed to hear something. And so we met in this small church, and I told him how sorry I was for what had happened to him. And I, of course, was just sobbing my eyes out, and Ronald was crying, and he took my hands and he said, I forgave you because we both got hurt. We both got let down. The system failed us. They failed our families. They failed everybody. They failed the community. They failed the other women who were raped by Bobby Poole. This had been a huge failure. And what we realized is Ron and I had so much more in common than we could ever, have not in common, because we'd both been really, really hurt. And we talked for hours, and really the end of it became friends. And that was the shift. So that was when I began to shift. It had been 13 years. And I could physically feel pieces of my body, pieces of my spirit find their way back together again for the first time since the night of the rape. And I thought, well, that's good. That's done. That's over. I'll go live life and you'll go live life. But of course, the world found out about us. And it took on a life of its own. And before I could really understand what was happening, There was, 2020, People Magazine, Good Morning America, the Red Book, all these different journalists and television shows that were like, oh, this is unusual. Let's hear from these two people. And that's when I got trapped in that space of that somehow it had been my fault. And I didn't understand that it had not been my fault, nor could it had ever been my fault. Because had Bobby Poole not raped me, had Bobby Poole not raped the second woman, this could never have happened. And so, but I didn't have the words for that. I just kind of kept wearing the scarlet letter for decades until one day I was asked to be on a panel, and the question was not what happened to you. It was, how did the wrongful conviction hurt you? And no one had ever asked me that question. And I started to cry so hard because no one had ever given me permission to talk about my harm. That essentially, through the narrative that I was talking through, that my harm got erased out of the story.
Right. So who decided that it was your fault?
The world decided. The criminal justice system decided. Audiences decided. I mean, I would get death threats, and I would have to be taken off a stage at times and locked into a safe place. I mean, it was really, really bad. Men would say things to me about rape and sexual assault that like no rational human being would ever say to someone, particularly a rape survivor. And so the trauma, I mean, I had the trauma of the rape, I had the trauma of the wrongful conviction, but then I had these decades of trauma that every time I told the story, I not only was I re-traumatizing my brain, but the world was then casting anger and hate and venom and blame to me.
Do you feel there was a racial component to this?
Oh, absolutely. And that was part of the not the false narrative, but the kind of like inaccurate narrative, because Bobby Poole was in fact an African-American man. I mean, there was you couldn't change the races of what happened, right? I was indeed a white female, and I indeed had been sexually assaulted at knife point and almost killed. And you can't change the race of the person who was innocent. He was an innocent African-American man, but the guilty person was a guilty African-American man. And so people tried to make this like, To Kill a Mockingbird story, and it wasn't To Kill a Mockingbird story. In the cases that we work on at Healing Justice, no one's gotten the race wrong. Whether it's the crime victim being white or African-American or male or female, like those are variables that you can't change. And nor did they get the race and the gender of the person they thought had done this to them. Now, there is race in the system, and I will talk about racism in the system all day long, because it is there, and it is deep, and it's entrenched, and it's historical, and honestly, it's intentional. I mean, we built racism into our criminal justice system with intent, and malice. I mean, you can't get away from that.
Did the hatred toward you have to do with racism?
Absolutely.
You're a white woman and you harmed a black man.
And the reality is, I didn't harm a black man.
No, I'm not saying you did.
Yeah.
I'm saying in the narrative.
The narrative was that. But, Ronald and I have talked many, many times that the person who hurt both of us was Bobby Poole. I mean, Bobby Poole knew that Ronald Cotton had gone to prison for his crime. Bobby Poole intentionally, with malice, hurt both of us. I mean, he was a really bad person, and he intentionally inflicted pain on everybody. But Bobby Poole's never been blamed in our story.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting when you and I spoke, I think I said this today, that my own purpose has been to humanize. So Initially, I wanted to interview people who had inflicted harm. I had someone on the podcast to talk about military torture, and it's an issue I'm really passionate about. And initially, I'd hoped to get a soldier who had inflicted some torture, but who had some moral injury and could talk about it, so the rest of us can understand what happens when someone sinks to a level of harm. But it didn't really happen that way. So I'm interviewing people and humanizing nonetheless, because the people who've come on are very interesting, including you. So I'd like to ask you then how you got to healing justice, and if you could say something about what restorative justice is, because I'm sure that's a part of what you do, but I don't think a lot of people know it.
Mhm.
And I think our criminal justice system tends to be extraordinarily punitive. And so restorative justice is, I think, of crucial importance.
Yeah, it is. And what Ron and I had no idea that we were doing that day in April of 1997 was indeed using restorative justice principles. Because restorative justice is victim initiated. And in this case, Ronald and I were both victims.
Yeah.
But it asks the three questions of how were you harmed? What do you need? And whose obligation is it to repair that harm? That's in true restorative justice, victim initiated, and victim offender dialogue. In our case, of course, the person who had inflicted the harm was Bobby Poole, but it was also the criminal justice system. And in our story, I will say that most of the people that were involved in the beginning, Mike Galden, the original district attorney, Jim Robertson, Ron's defense attorney throughout all of it, Phil Mosley, we have all become very close friends and together have helped repair harm to each other and to our communities. So in Ron's and my case, we use restorative justice principles or guidelines in that moment in April of 1997. Now, throughout my work and what I was doing out there in the universe, giving speeches, writing articles, teaching, what I continued to see was exonerated men and women coming out of prison after long, long periods of time that had not committed these crimes, and the incredible depth of harm and grief and loss that had occurred to them and their families. I was meeting their mothers, their fathers, their children that had been left behind, their siblings, their wives, their husbands, and listening to their stories of loss and grief and harm. But I was also meeting with crime victims from these cases and listening to those stories as well, which were gut-wrenchingly difficult. And what I kept thinking to myself was, we have all these people that are being harmed by a system failure, a system train wreck. It left the station and it just created a catastrophic, event. And in true restorative justice, somebody should be there in this aftermath space and saying, oh my God, how do we repair this harm? What do you need? What are some of the resources? But there wasn't anybody. I mean, you would see these television shows and you read these articles about, the latest exonerated person, and they're standing on the court steps and their arms are raised like freedom at last. And the interviewer's like, what are you going to eat when you leave? And what is the first thing you want to do? And they're always, I want fresh seafood, or I want a big bowl of pasta, or I just want to get to know my family again. And that sounds really good and it makes people feel warm and fuzzy. But if you talk to them 6 months later, their lives are a mess because they're not the 18-year-old that left home.
No.
They're not the same person that left. They've come back and they're different. And there's a lot of broken spaces in there. But there was no place for these people to connect and to create community and to create a sense of healing. And there really wasn't anything for these victims. I mean, not only was there nothing, the big zero for the victims of these cases, they were not even like acknowledged that they were hurt. And I mean, at best, they were erased from the stories. At worst, they were blamed. And so there's all this terrible, terrible stuff that was happening that the system should have been repairing, but the system wasn't going to repair. And certainly the perpetrator that created all of it was not going to be there. And oftentimes weren't even held responsible or were even known. And so in 2015, I just decided I was going to launch a nonprofit that addressed this kind of aftermath of a wrongful conviction space. And I wanted to go about it in the direction of restorative justice, because I'd seen it work with Ron and I. I'd seen us being able to repair each other, ourselves, our families, people around us. And I thought, why can't this be done on a national scale? Why can't we bring people together that have shared harms, that have been hurt by the same system in different ways, to a space that we create that is safe, that acknowledges the incredible depths of hurt, that they can witness each other and they can validate each other's stories and griefs and losses, and create a community that provides connection. And in that connection, you create belonging. And there is clear scientific evidence that when people feel like they belong, they can begin to heal.
Mm.
And that's where the healing was taking place. And I was watching it happen. I was watching a rape survivor sit with an exoneree, maybe not from the same case, could have been a very different case, who was convicted of rape, and listen to each other's experiences and realize that the system failed them both. And they can help repair each other and themselves and the community, and then go back home and continue that kind of healing, that active participation in their healing.
I just want to ask you a question, which is for a second going back to the original part of the story. When you say the system failed you, do you also mean that you were propelled to identify Ron Cotton?
Yeah.
Can you just say a sentence about that?
Well, I mean, we know so much more now about trauma and memory and how that impacts our capacity to remember things and to correctly recall things, and how memory can be very easily contaminated and distorted. And, things can be placed into our memory that wasn't there an hour ago. And of course, I didn't know that at the time, but in 1984, we were still collecting people's memory. Like we had been collecting it for 30, 40, 50 years. We hadn't caught up in science to help people understand what trauma and memory does. And so how can you best retrieve a victim or witness's memory? Because our memory is really nothing more than trace evidence. It's as easily contaminated as fingerprints and blood and any other types of biological evidence, right? It's very easy to contaminate that, but we didn't understand that. So oftentimes people collecting the memory of a person's, recall of what they've just seen or experienced, the person collecting it would drop in pieces of information, right? And the victim might say, well, I think his hair was brown. And somewhere over here, the police officer's like, the guy that I think did it's got brown hair, brownish blonde hair, black hair, something. And they'll say, well, could the hair have been sandy blonde, almost brown? And then all of a sudden, the memory begins to shift. And you don't know what's happening up here. You don't know what's happening. And before you understand what's just happened, your memory has now changed. And that's what happened to me. I mean, I've got a memory of what just happened to me. I'm not under drugs. I'm not under alcohol. I'm in close proximity to the face. I've got varying degrees of light. I'm a straight A student. I've got a really good capacity to remember things. I remembered. I go to the police station and we begin to put together a composite sketch. And so they start using what at that time was an identikit, and they pull out the 75 different eyebrows, and they're like, is this the eyebrow you remember? Is this the eyebrow? Is it bushier? Is it thinner? Is it longer? Is it darker? And so you're trying to, remember individual pieces of the human face, which, by the way, we can't do. Our memories can't do that. We see things as an entire face. We can't, categorize pieces of, the parts of our face. And so as they start showing me the 75 eyebrows and the 150 noses, your memory starts getting distorted.
It's flooding.
And it's just like moving. And so by the time the composite sketch was done and they hand it to me and they go, does this look like the guy you remember? I'm like, well, yeah, it looks like the guy I remember. But the operative word there is like. And once I say, yes, it looks like the person that, just assaulted me 3 hours ago, I've got a new image that's now like smushing my original memory. So 3 days later, of course, as I go to the photographic lineup, Bobby Poole's not in it. There's 6 photographs. The photograph they use of Ronald is 3 years old. And they use it because he looks the closest like the composite sketch. And when I pick out his photograph and they go, that's who we thought it was. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's amazing, right? I did it. I did it. And then 7 days later, when I go to do the physical lineup, the only person that was in the physical lineup that also had been in the photographic lineup was Ronald Cotton. And so in my memory, I see this person and I'm like, that's him. And of course it's him. I just picked him out in a photograph 7 days before.
Yeah. Okay.
And again, I'm given that verbal confirmation of the job. That's who you picked out in the photograph. And so, and I want to say that many of these that are done are not done in some duplicitous manner by bad cops who just don't care. I mean, most of the police that are doing this feel like they're doing the best job, and they feel like that's the suspect. I mean, there's some bad cops, there's some bad everybody's, that do things for the wrong reasons. But the train now has left the station.
I mean, I hope so, because, in preparing to interview, to have as a guest Stephen Drizzen, I watched gobs of stuff. And, the people like Tommy Ward still sitting in jail. I mean, it's beyond the beyond for me. It's like, I think he's, 60 something years old. His whole life has been spent in jail. He's not guilty. Everybody knows he's not guilty, but the prosecution is doing an appeal and they don't want him to go home like during that appeal. It just beats, I can't imagine. And I do feel that a lot of the public does not know anything about this. I don't.
No, the public doesn't understand this at all because they get the 30-minute, tutorial on, Law and Order or whatever other crime show they're watching. And they don't understand like all the nuances of memory and trauma and police investigations and what's really, really happening and what really goes on. And, that there's such an important piece to all of these stories that I hit on because it's so important. That it's more than a case of a wrongful conviction. It's a case of wrongful liberty. Because when we fail, we have failed the victims first and foremost. I mean, they're the first people hurt, right? They're the first people hurt. And they're given this false sense of justice, right? The system worked. You can move on now. Then you had an innocent person in prison and their families are devastated and they may or may not ever come home. But there's a guilty person that's out there committing rapes and murders and child abuse. I mean, it should scare everyone That's the thing I try to talk about. It's like, okay, so if you don't care about victims, I don't understand that. But, you don't care about innocent people in prison, I don't understand that. But certainly you care about like community and public safety. Like that actually could impact you and your family. And so I really try hard to talk about it in what I believe is a more truthful explanation, which is wrongful liberty.
Yeah. So, can I ask you to tell a story of people who've gotten together at Healing Justice? Like a nice story.
Yeah, we've got so many, so many. We worked with a young woman who was sexually assaulted as a child at knife point, survived, tried to help, made identification. Guy went to prison. 17 years later, DNA exonerates him, and it just destroys her life. Because she talks about growing up. She one day she's playing with dolls, and the next day she said, I put the little girl in a box somewhere safe so she'd never get hurt again. But then this comes up, right? The wrong person went to prison. The guilty person continued to harm other young women. And so she fell into addiction.
Right.
And just, it was just unbelievably difficult. And when she began to come to Healing Justice and to the retreats, she's been drug-free for, I think, 5 years now. She's amazing. She's really incredible. She's the same husband. He's stuck with her and has loved her. She's got grandchildren now. Life is good for her. And she talks about having come to Healing Justice, and for the first time that she was allowed to let the little girl come back out because this was safe for her. And so we began to work on healing that broken child. How do you come back and become your own perfect nurturer for that child that had to be put away to keep her safe? And so we do that in a lot of different ways. We use art and expressive arts. We use improv, games and play as a community. We do lots of different types of ceremonies, like letting go ceremonies and gratitude ceremonies, and all of it builds on itself through the weekend of the retreat. She talks a lot about being able to be in a community of people that not only understood but loved her, like exonerees who walk away and like love her. And so there's this sense of real healing that takes place in these retreats. We have a mother of an exoneree who came, and her son had been wrongfully convicted of rape and murder. And when he came home, the whole family was broken, and she was so angry. Like her whole body was angry. And we invited her and one of her daughters to come to a retreat. And I watched like her face shift through the weekend. And she left the retreat. She went back home. Her longtime boyfriend saw a shift in her and took her to see. They love Elvis. He took her to see an Elvis impersonator concert, and it was there during the song "I Can't Help Falling in Love with You" he proposed. But I don't know what happened to you in North Carolina, but something has changed, and she accepted. She came back to a second retreat, and her second art project was, our second project that you do is you take an old pair of shoes. I have hundreds of them, and you paint them and design them so that people could understand the shoes that you had walked in. What was the journey you had been on from a visual place? So you look at that, and without any words, you know what that looked like for her. But her shoe project, she did one that was in black, that was dark, and it had been that journey. And the second one was white, and it was her new life that she was walking towards with this, marriage, and it became the centerpiece at her wedding. And she and her husband came back for her third retreat, and he was just like, this has been amazing. Like, this has just changed everything for us, because she was able to let go of that anger. And she realized that that anger was really a tombstone she had been carrying around her neck for so long. She was able to let that go and move forward. We had an exoneree. We had an exoneree that came that had just come out of Angola after 20 years. He'd gone in at 16 years old, and he was still on like an ankle monitor, and the only job he could get was cleaning bus stops in New Orleans, like from midnight to 4. And you can imagine what happens at bus stops: the vomit, the human waste. That's the only job he could get, was cleaning that. And after his first retreat, he went home, and I had to be in New Orleans for something a month later. And I said, "Hey, let me take you to dinner." And we were on the phone, and he said, "Great. By the way, I just want you to know that you healed me. This retreat, Healing Justice, healed me so much. I quit my job." And I was like, "Oh gosh. Okay, well, I'm not sure if that's the direction I needed you to go." But when we sat down and talked, he said, "That retreat made me realize my value and my worth, who I am and who I was and who I've always been." And he started his own nonprofit, working with young boys of color in New Orleans, helping to tutor them and mentor them so that they stay away from drugs and gangs and guns and violence. And he does this, he's just a really remarkable person that, knows his own inherent worth and didn't allow the system to say that, to tell him, to narrate who he was. Like, he claimed his own story and his own truth. But we've got so many of these stories of people that we've worked with and been able to help them gain the tools and resources that they can begin to walk that journey towards healing.
When we were watching Making a Murderer, have you seen it? I mean, it's like grueling. I mean, hours and hours and hours. And one of the things my husband said, he commented on the fact that there seemed to be so little help, at least in that story, for the family of the victim. I mean, instead of any help, what was going on seemed so political that the district attorney and the law enforcement just kept giving the same storyline, that this one person is guilty and dying to tell his story, and that's why he confessed, and it just seemed to be that there wasn't a force there. I'm not saying, I mean, you're talking about a completely different thing, and it's quite beautiful, but that there obviously are cases where the family of the victim is just encouraged to sort of hate the accused no matter what.
Well, I think that's true. I think that, and that's of course the opposite of what restorative justice lens looks like, because the restorative justice lens is directed towards the victims and trying to help them articulate what they need. So that's the restorative justice lens. Like, what do you need? How can we help repair the harm? And the criminal justice system is not necessarily committed to repairing harm. The system is committed to us versus them, good versus bad, right and wrong. And it becomes so entrenched in keeping people angry so that we can continue this punitive lens. And I'm not saying that there's not a space for punitive punishments. I mean, because I think there are people that need to not be walking around free like you and me. They just hurt people, and it's not safe. But I also believe that if we began to think through the restorative justice lens, through the reconciliation lens, in people's lives at much earlier times, and work with children and families and communities to help repair harms, we wouldn't get to this space later where we've got really angry 18 and 19-year-olds that are lashing out because they've been hurt and harmed for so long. So, I mean, I agree with you. And I know in my own personal journey through this, it wasn't until I was able to look at what happened to me in the story and think, I wonder what happened to Bobby Poole that made him the kind of person that would want to hurt so many people. Because children come into the world perfect, and they come into the world loving little beings, and something happens along the way, and we hurt children and they get traumatized, and we don't help repair. And so somewhere along that journey, Bobby Poole was really, really hurt in a way that he lashed out on the universe, and particularly women. And that shifting for me was important for lots of reasons. One is because it allowed me to release the power that he had over me and what that night had over me. I still will always be triggered. I will always, there will be things in my life, but it allowed me to take my happiness and my joy back. It also allowed me to see people for more than a single act in their lives, and to not others. And so I began to get, very involved in child abuse organizations, and became a lay therapist with families that were in that space. So, the whole journey for me, of course, has been that unpacking and unfolding all the stuff that happened to me, and find ways that I can move through the world in a healing, loving, compassionate way.
One of the things I think about is that a lot of us have been raised in a, if not punitive, kind of harsh, that good or bad way. And we can be very critical of ourselves. People think of America, or let's say, as indulgent, or as, but indulgent is not the same as secure. It's different. And I think the more we can empathize with ourselves, the more we can empathize with other people, and empathy changes us. Just it because we start to look at the story, or we want to know the story of how a person got there. And I like that. It's one of the things I think that we learn about people best when we know their story, and there's a story just opens us up, because we start to, imagine ourselves in that shoe. I used to think of, I think it's still a good idea, of like fifth graders learning about the Civil War by being given a script in which they have to play a certain character, and they have to dress as that character and kind of immerse themselves in that character. And, whether it's a slave owner or a slave, or something that kind of gets the story of how a person gets somewhere, because I think that just opens us up. And I think that's so much what we need. We won't get into politics. We don't have the time, and we don't need to, but it's like the idea of the good or the bad, rather than consensus and working together and walking in each other's shoes, and how did that person get there? And so I hope I kept my promise, Jennifer.
Yes. Thank you, Carol.
Okay. So, because I had no intention of keeping you in any narrative. And if anything, I think what you've done with all of this is just beautiful and extremely inspiring. And I just want to ask you, how do people get in touch with Healing Justice?
Yeah, so you can just go on our website, which is www.healingjusticeproject.org. And we've got lots of ways of being involved, and you'll meet the people that we worked with. You'll see some of the art that they've done. You'll hear their stories. And we're the only organization in the entire United States of America that does this work with everyone who's been directly harmed by a wrongful conviction. We say all harmed, all healed. It's really looking through a lens of concentric circles and everybody that's been impacted.
Well, listen, I'd like to thank you. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I hope we meet again because I think your work is extremely important and inspiring, and I I am haunted by the criminal justice system in America, and you know I've read a lot about certain other countries that bring out the best in people and want even criminals to heal. I'm not saying that everybody can heal, but are not involved in a privatization and a profit making. But I really thank you for your work. It's very moving, and I congratulate you on coming out of this and claiming your own narrative, which is very powerful.
Thank you, Carol. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Right.
So Jennifer Thompson, thanks, and hopefully we'll talk.
Right.
Okay. Take care.